teenager in New York, California was a place where people never had to deal with the problems I was dealing with every day. If they wanted food, they'd sit under a palm tree and an orange would fall down into their hands, and if they wanted sunshine, they always had it.
In the decade before the Great Depression, jobs and opportunities in the Golden State were plentiful, and the population had nearly doubled. In home movies, Californians celebrated the good life.
California was the land of milk and honey. Everybody thought that you can get to California and get a job, you will make it, you know.
I'm going to California.
So I talked my dad into lending me a $5 bill, and I started hitchhiking south.
I'm going to California, where they sleep out every night.
By 1934, there was no pot of gold in California. In Los Angeles, 1 in 4 were unemployed.
Young people like myself had little expectation of finding work, and the only kind of job I could find would be by going through the Printing Trade Center in downtown Los Angeles, door to door. You'd ask, is there anything doing today?
Even for somebody protected, working, it was still awful, because you could not shut yourself off from what was happening.
There was no federal safety net. America was the only major industrialized country without a national system of Social Security to help the unemployed, the elderly, the disabled.
There weren't very many signs of recovery, and California hadn't changed politically very much, despite the fact that Franklin Roosevelt was president, and there was some New Deal legislation that was rolling.
Roosevelt hoped for Democratic victories in the November elections to make California part of his New Deal coalition. But the Democratic Party in California was weak and divided. It faced a powerful Republican organization backed by leaders of the state's major industries: oil, agriculture, and the movies. Hollywood films made it possible, just for a moment, to forget the hard times outside. MGM was the biggest, most successful studio.
The politics of MGM at the time was guided or inspired by Mayer himself, Louis B. Mayer. Mayer tried to identify himself and the company as much as possible with the Republican Party. On the other hand, Warner Brothers and First National did just the opposite. They tried to identify themselves with the Democratic Party.
Warner Brothers films combined entertainment with a reality as grim as the streets of Los Angeles.
Not far from our church, there was a Hoover town that was built out of old packing crates and the like. We knew what people were going through. I saw class distinctions. I saw racial distinctions.
Across the main streets of Los Angeles, one could, as one walked down them, see signs in the windows, no colored persons allowed, we do not cater to blacks.
You could not be a person born of Oriental extraction, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, or whatever, and live in California during the 20s and the 30s and know that the laws governing us were not equal. My parents, for example, under the California Alien Land Law, could not own a home.
I saw the privileged people getting more privileges, the poor getting poorer.
Everywhere you read about the destruction of crops. I remember the story of almost a quarter-mile long pile of oranges as high as your head, and they'd throw gasoline up over it and set fire to it. And that outraged me. That filled me with rage. And it continues to fill me with rage. We were hungry. Then you think, God Almighty, what's the matter? Where's the sense in this circumstance?
There's no excuse for poverty in a state as rich as California. We can produce so much food that we have to dump it into our bays.
Upton Sinclair was a world-famous writer and socialist. His 1906 novel, The Jungle, exposed unsanitary conditions in the meatpacking industry and led to America's first federal meat inspection law. Sinclair had written 47 books attacking powerful industries and institutions. Hollywood, the press, the church would not forgive nor forget his attacks.
When I first came into the socialist movement, we had our wonderful dream that we held of perfect and complete democracy achieved overnight, and that was lovely to talk about. But in the meantime, we had a set of immediate demands.
The Socialist Party of America had campaigned for national unemployment and health insurance and old age pensions. Socialists believed capitalism was doomed, and they advocated government takeover of private industry. But in the depths of the Depression, Sinclair feared that people could not wait for the socialist dream. With the elections of 1934 coming up, he switched to the Democratic Party. His plan to become governor of California.
I have been asked to stand as a candidate at the Democratic primaries and to put before the people a program to end poverty in California.
It was Upton Sinclair who gave me the real stimulus going into the direction of the political side of what the kingdom of heaven or earth should be like.
We needed a voice. We needed somebody who would rally the people. And he did present a program.
To promote his program, Sinclair wrote a 60-page book predicting his own election. His plan, epic, End Poverty in California, called for the state to turn over idle factories and farms to the unemployed.
There was so much good land in California that wasn't being farmed, so many factories that were empty and silent, and so many able people who could have worked those farms and factories. And we just thought of the waste.
Sinclair predicted that a takeover by the unemployed would meet strong opposition.
Get up!
The whole power of vested privilege will rise against it, he wrote. They are afraid the plan will put into the minds of the unemployed the idea of getting access to land and machinery by the use of their ballots. The epic plan was inspired in part by California's cooperatives, communities where the poor and unemployed bartered goods and services. In 1934, California had 176 cooperatives. Sinclair proposed a statewide system of cooperatives based on production for use instead of production for profit. He believed it would ultimately put profit-making enterprises out of business.
We do not intend what is called subsistence farming. We mean mass production under modern conditions.
The land workers are to have the best land and the factory workers the best machinery. And they will be able to produce great quantities of wealth and to make comfort and plenty for themselves.
Life in the cooperatives was romanticized in the Hollywood film Our Daily Bread.
Hey, Carpenter! Yeah? Look, I'm a stonemason. I'll build you a fireplace if you'll set up the framework for my house. Okay. These stones have got me licked. And I don't do so good with the wood myself.
Our Daily Bread was the brainchild of director King Vidor. Karen Morley played the female lead.
It was not the kind of part I really was very interested in because it was a goody-goody lead, and I was much more interested in playing women who died or killed people. King Vidor was a very musical person. His films always, you can see, are similar to music. And the climax of Daily Bread was set to music by metronome. When we shot those scenes, there was a metronome going for us all the time. I had no idea what a co-op was, and I didn't know whether it was a good idea or not. But I think that King, who was a conservative person, had an idea that people should just get together and help each other.
Much to Upton Sinclair's surprise, his campaign took off like wildfire. He traveled the state promoting the epic plan. Within weeks, his book, I, Governor, was the fastest-selling book in California. The bumblebee became the symbol of his army of volunteers. Hundreds of Epic clubs formed the heart of the campaign. Epic supporters published a weekly newspaper with a circulation of 500,000. They ran Epic rodeos, drama groups, picnics, and sewing bees.
These billboards sprouted all the way around. It was quite spectacular. You couldn't help spending time reading each one and going from one to another. I thought it was very hopeful because it meant change, and there were lots of things about California and life as we knew it that weren't totally satisfactory.
Epic meetings were big mass meetings in those days. It was amazing the crowds that he drew. And he depended on the people for his money. So people who had 10 cents contributed 10 cents, and they stormed the meetings.
One of the things that I hadn't expected was to see how many older people were there. Now, they were like everyone else, looking for something better. And, of course, in those days, older people had no safety net.
There would be 5,000 people inside of the auditorium, its full seating capacity, and there might be 4,000 or 5,000 people outside trying to get in.
When I went out on the warpath in the Depression of 1934, I've never forgotten the first meeting at which I spoke in the big hall up in San Luis Obispo. And when I got through telling our epic program of production for use, the men crowded around me, and they said to me, Mr. Sinclair, what are we going to do? We haven't got food to feed our families next week. And that was a condition in California at that time. Well, we threw an almighty scare into the minds and the hearts of the people who were running this state.
The summer of 1934 was a season of protest. New federal laws supported the right to join unions, and across America, a wave of strikes tested the New Deal's commitment to labor. In San Francisco, striking longshoremen had closed the port for 2 months. Violence erupted when police broke through strikers' picket lines. 2 men were killed, more than 70 injured. Within hours, California's governor, Frank Merriam, declared a state of emergency.
Forbearance with the striking longshoremen in San Francisco has passed the point of common sense and good citizenship. I have ordered the National Guard of California to move into San Francisco to safeguard life, to protect state property, and to preserve order.
Labor leaders believed that Merriam had called out the Guard to break the strike. In support of the longshoremen, more than 100,000 union workers walked off their jobs calling for a citywide general strike. San Francisco shut down. People began to hoard food. The Roosevelt administration was now torn between supporting or condemning the general strike. New Deal Administrator Hugh Johnson spoke for those who felt that labor had gone too far.
You are living out here under the stress of a general strike. Now the right of dissatisfied men to strike against a recalcitrant employer is inviolate. But the general strike is quite another matter. That is a threat to the community. That is a menace to government. That is civil war.
After 4 days, workers called off the general strike. Longshoremen and ship owners agreed to arbitration, and the city came back to life. For many, the strike was a warning of the power which the New Deal had placed in the hands of ordinary working people. And troops on the streets of San Francisco triggered fears that the country was on the brink of revolution.
In addition to riflemen,
Moviegoers across America saw alarming reports of the general strike.
Also, the police have organized the only mounted gas squad in the world. They've been ordered to round up the Reds, the radical agitators blamed for the virulence of the strike. They're out to comb the railroad yards, to rout out nests of communists hiding in empty boxcars. That gas will drive them into the open. Yep, there's a bunch of them now, dodging the stinging gas clouds. The entire waterfront...
The Democratic primary was just 5 weeks away. In this volatile atmosphere, Upton Sinclair's radical ideas alarmed mainstream Democrats. At a Hollywood luncheon hosted by Warner Brothers, Democratic National Committee Chairman James Farley was asked to alert Roosevelt that Sinclair could win the primary. Farley told Roosevelt, "Everyone out there wants you to come out against Sinclair." Roosevelt decided to watch and wait.
If they say that we are crazy,
By the end of August, the number of Epic clubs had grown to 1,000.
It was very exhilarating. We were doing something on a low level, door-to-door meetings and stuff like that. But we were all very, very excited. We thought we were going to not change the world, but to help California and help people.
Epic supporters stepped up efforts to recruit new voters. By primary day, there were 350,000 new Democrats. For the first time in California history, Democrats outnumbered Republicans. To widen his support within the party, Sinclair selected Sheridan Downey, a mainstream Democrat, as his running mate. The slate was known as Uppy and Downey. August 28th. Epic triumphed over traditional Democrats. Sinclair won with 436,000 votes, more than all the other candidates combined.
We mean that California shall be behind President Roosevelt in his effort to give the New Deal to the whole nation. Ours is a democratic plan. We are resting upon the consent of the entire people, and we expect to get it.
Former socialist Upton Sinclair was now the Democrats' nominee for governor of California.
The showing of Upton Sinclair in the primary was so magnificent, and it so far exceeded even our wildest expectations. It suddenly became apparent to us that this was for real, that here was a chance to elect Sinclair.
Times are soon coming, all business will be humming, and we'll give old poverty the air. If this happy plan is phony, then the rest is all baloney. So vote for Downey and Upton Sinclair.
Sinclair would face the incumbent governor, Republican Frank Merriam, in the November general election. For the first time in 35 years, it looked as if the Republican might lose.
My parents, they were worried that Merriam was more conservative than the progressive Republican governors before, and was sort of a dour-looking person, and the Democrats would be motivated to get out to vote, and the Republicans wouldn't care because they didn't like Merriam. And I remember my dad saying, gee, I don't know whether Merriam can make it.
Sinclair's runaway success also worried the Democrats. Could Sinclair be trusted, or would his radical policies become an embarrassment to Roosevelt's New Deal?
Upton Sinclair caused a lot of confusion in the Democratic Party because he admitted he was a socialist, and most of the Democrats were not socialists, and so they didn't know what he was going to do to the party or what was going to happen in the future.
There was no hiding the discontent of traditional Democrats. To get their support, Sinclair knew he needed the president's endorsement. He cabled Roosevelt. "It is important that we should win next November. I would very much like to consult you. Your reply confidential."
I think that he felt, and we felt, that if he had a chance to talk to FDR in person, that there could be a endorsement from the White House, which would be a tremendously important factor in the final.
The president's secretary cabled in return, "If you are coming east and would like to see the president, I will be glad to arrange for that with the very distinct understanding that there is to be no discussion of your campaign or politics in your state." The president was preparing for a political battle much larger than the one in California. Roosevelt's dream was to create a national system of Social Security protection, something never tried before in America. He had asked Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins to draft legislation establishing a permanent federal insurance program for old age, health care, and unemployment.
It is of primary importance that we begin to lay the basis in the form of reserves against depression for the paying of regular and steady and fair incomes to the people who may be laid off through no fault of their own in the next depression.
Roosevelt's critics feared that Social Security was socialism and would bring government into the workplace and people's private lives as never before.
A few timid people who fear progress will try to give you new and strange names for what we are doing. Sometimes they will call it fascism, and sometimes communism, and sometimes regimentation, and sometimes socialism. But in so doing, they are trying to make very complex and theoretical something that is really very simple and very practical. I believe that what we are doing today is a necessary fulfillment of what Americans have always been doing, a fulfillment of old and tested American ideals.
Amid this debate, Sinclair's arrival at Roosevelt's family home in Hyde Park was national news.
Roosevelt's attitude toward Upton Sinclair's candidacy was obviously mixed because he was the Democratic candidate, and Roosevelt's inclination was to support Democrats whenever he could. On the other hand, I think he found Upton Sinclair's ideas too radical, too socialist.
To the surprise of many, Sinclair's scheduled one-hour visit extended to 2. Sinclair later called them 2 of the most interesting hours of his life.
The effect that FDR had on people was quite extraordinary. He would charm them, but not in a phony way. He certainly didn't want to have Upton Sinclair leaving the house with a glum look on his face, greeting the reporters.
Sinclair left convinced Roosevelt had agreed to support production for use. But he honored his vow of silence and gave no details to the press. The next day, he traveled to Washington to discuss the epic program with Federal Emergency Relief Administration Director Harry Hopkins.
Hopkins actually endorsed Sinclair, which surprised us because it seemed to go beyond his own ideas of what kind of work the unemployed should be doing.
It now appeared that Sinclair had both the support of the voters and the attention of the president.
In California, the alarm bells began to ring everywhere. People who owned, the bankers and the merchants and manufacturers and all who were used to a given system felt threatened.
Our main concern was that he was not the caliber of person to handle important state governmental problems. He didn't really know very much about, if he knew anything, about how state government works. He had a program that wouldn't have worked, an agrarian program. We were not ready to go back to a barter system.
But a return to the land was capturing people's imaginations. Hollywood grew nervous.
All right, Ben, get in the harness. Let's do some power.
Studio chiefs blocked Our Daily Bread's release in California, fearing that its glorification of co-ops would aid Epic. Sinclair's plans extended beyond farms and factories to Hollywood itself. He proposed letting unemployed actors and technicians use idle studios to make their own movies. He also planned new taxes on industry and the rich. With only 2 months before the election, California's industrial leaders went on the attack. MGM studio chief Louis B. Mayer joined forces with orange growers C.C. Teague of Sunkist and Harry Chandler, publisher of the Los Angeles Times. For 3 days in September, prominent Republicans met in downtown Los Angeles to raise money to defeat Sinclair. In a first for American politics, they hired an advertising agency and a political consulting firm to direct a major statewide campaign.
Our job was to see that Sinclair did not become governor of California. The fact that if he didn't become governor of California, we were stuck with Miriam was just a shame. We made a very careful study to determine just what kind of man Sinclair was. And we thought that some of his observations on things that most people think are the backbone of Americanism, our churches, our schools, they were offensive to the deeply felt emotions of most ordinary people. We had an editorial cartoonist, Bill Lenoir. Bill made one cartoon that I remember very well. This was a picture of a beautiful young bride in a white dress coming out of a church. A lovely, lovely picture, except that she had on the front of her dress a big black blot, which we called the blot of Sinclairism. On this blot, we superimposed precisely what Sinclair had said about the institution of marriage.
The cartoons attacking Sinclair were distributed free of charge to newspapers throughout the state. The Los Angeles Times launched a campaign of its own, regularly featured in a box on the front page.
Well, my job at the Times was editorial researcher, and they sent me to the library to verify these quotes.
What is the purpose of the Christian religion? Its aim is to teach America wage slaves to kiss the hand that lashes them. Personally, I am prepared to go as far as the extreme sex radical in the defense of love.
They ran under a heading and said Sinclair says this or Sinclair says that, but actually the quotes were statements made by characters in these novels. They weren't Sinclair speaking himself.
The particular book on prophets of religion was one which they quoted out of context, to be sure, saying, look what he would do to religion, look what would happen at the church. And we had a church on Florence Avenue, and we had 2 electric signs, so I put up an electric lighted it during the night, and it was there 24 hours a day. I would rather vote for an atheist who acts like a Christian than a Christian who acts like an atheist. Well, we got a lot of reaction against that, you can be sure.
They had billboards over the state denouncing me, and whether it was true or whether it was not true didn't make any difference, provided it was to keep people from voting for the terrible Upton Sinclair.
As the election drew closer, even some of Sinclair's own supporters had doubts.
My chief interest was simply the notion of production for use. He had other ideas like funny money, some new medium of exchange that were not, from my point of view, feasible.
Sinclair's proposal for a new kind of currency, or scrip, to be used in the cooperatives became a prime target for anti-epic forces.
My parents were concerned that the plans that he espoused would bankrupt the state. The money wouldn't be worth anything.
The anti-Sinclair campaign distributed Sink Liar dollars. Labeled as the red currency, they bore the legend, "Endure poverty in California."
I remember reading in the paper, seeing the utopian sink liar, and they always underlined the liar. And then there were cartoons of people pouring over the Sierra into California. And the combination of that, plus the unsettled times, the Depression, the general strike in San Francisco, produced a pretty scary time around that election.
With only 6 weeks to Election Day, Sinclair knew he needed more than the epic movement to win. He needed the support of a reluctant Democratic Party machine, which he hoped to get at the party's state convention.
The eyes of the nation are on California's capital, where Upton Sinclair and the Democrats of California meet to plan the fall campaign.
Epic forces cheered from the balcony. Party regulars were skeptical.
I'd always been a Democrat, particularly a Woodrow Wilson Democrat, and Upton Sinclair didn't stack up with that kind of people. So I didn't know what to do. I couldn't get out and support him, even though he was a Democrat.
Augustus Hawkins, one of the first African Americans to campaign as a Democrat in California, was running for state assemblyman.
Blacks were not attracted to the epic movement as such. Minorities was just beginning to break through many barriers. In those days, we had a terrific time to get a black judge elected, the first one in the state, the first supervisor in the post office, and so forth. They were getting a piece of the action, and they wanted to protect it. And I suspect that many, just becoming a part of the middle class, also did not enter into the epic movement.
Mr. Sinclair, I have been in many Democratic conventions, but never one more harmonious than this.
Sinclair drafted the platform with party regular George Creel. To gain support from mainstream Democrats, Sinclair agreed to eliminate or change many epic proposals. He dropped his idea for statewide old age pensions to help clear the way for Roosevelt's National Social Security Plan. For the moment, it appeared that Sinclair had succeeded in uniting a divided party. The New York Times reported predictions of a Sinclair victory in November.
My friends, The harmony which you have seen in this convention today is a symbol of what you are going to see throughout our Golden State. We have put life into the old donkey, at least so far as California is concerned.
When an exhausted Sinclair returned home from the convention, he faced waiting reporters. One asked whether the unemployed would flood into California if EPIC was put into effect. Sinclair jokingly replied, "I told Harry Hopkins in Washington that if I am elected, half the unemployed will come to California and he will have to make plans to take care of them." The remark would return to haunt him.
California waters taste like cherry wine. California waters taste like cherry wine. But the Georgia waters...
We're in the midst of the Depression. The dean, Kip McMurray, called me into his office, and he pronounced my name correctly. He said, "Belly, I got a job for you." And I said, "What is it?" And he said, "It's being a bum." Well, that took me back a little, but when he told me it was, I think, $300-400 a month, then my spirits were lifted. What it was to go out and ride the rails and report back and say what the hobos were thinking of at that time. I, in no uncertain terms, told the people that were in Washington that the people of America weren't thinking of a revolution. These were ordinary people. These were people who had nothing wrong with them except that they couldn't work because there was no jobs out there and they wanted to work.
Go ahead, put me in a cell, lock me up. I'm sick of being hungry and cold. Sick of freight trains. Jail can't be any worse than the street, so give it to me.
Warner Brothers, in its support of the Roosevelt administration, portrayed a benevolent government as a source of hope.
Eddie, I'm going to dismiss your case.
You're gonna what?
Furthermore, I'm going to help you. I'll phone the personnel manager of the place that gave you that job and see that you go to work.
Gee, Judge.
I'm going to do my part. Now I want you to do yours.
The films that depicted life as I knew it, that showed unemployment or hunger or disability, were less important to me than films that depicted a life I had no idea about.
I'm young and healthy, and you've got time.
The ones with glamorous, rich, important people, I drank that in. That was life to a young teenager.
In the 30s, pictures were glamorous and exciting. It was just a marvelous experience. You'd walk in on a carpet that practically bounced and have an usher with a little flashlight would lead you down to your seat. And the seat was beautifully upholstered.
3 weeks before the election, moviegoers in California saw these newsreels on the governor's race.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am the inquiring cameraman. All day I travel around California, the highways and the byways, the downtown districts, the residence districts, the factory districts, all for the purpose of digging out voters of California to express their views for your edification. Remember?
These newsreels would become one of the most controversial elements in the campaign.
Face the camera and microphone. If they seem awkward, bear with them. I don't rehearse them. I'm impartial. I thank you.
Would you mind telling us who your favorite candidate is for governor?
Sinclair.
Well, have you made a study of his plan?
Yes, I've studied a little bit. Some of them are rather radical, but I think they'll be modified when he gets into office.
I see. Well, now, listen. Do you really believe that he can end poverty in California?
Well, no, I don't think so, but... well, I don't know what to say about that.
I'm going to vote for Merriam because I want a job. And to drive all the capital out of the country, who's going to pay us?
And you think, then, that Merriam would be the safest for us all?
Absolutely. There's no time to trade horses in the middle of the stream.
Well, Mr. Sinclair, I have something new, that new epic plan. I think it's time that we should try something new out again.
And you think the epic plan will work?
I don't know, but I'm willing to take a chance on it.
Now, Mr. Skinner, just who are you going to vote for?
I'm going to vote for Marion, because I need prosperity.
An article in Variety stated that the newsreels were produced as part of the anti-Sinclair campaign.
I just graduated from school last year, and Sinclair says that our school system is rotten, and I know that this isn't true, and I've been able to find a good position during this depression, and I'd like to be able to keep it.
I'm going to vote for Upton St. Clair.
Will you tell us why?
Upton St. Clair is the author of the Russian government, and it worked out very well there, and I think it should do here.
The New York Times reported that the anti-Sinclair newsreels were created by Hollywood film crews in a campaign led by Louis B. Mayer and MGM.
The movie industry was a considerable political force in California at the time. And to have the backing, if you're going to run for district attorney or if you're going to run for governor or mayor of a local town, you wanted to get the backing of one of the big companies.
Of all the studio chiefs, Louis B. Mayer was the most active in the Republican Party. He had risen from immigrant poverty to achieve the American dream. Mayer was a staunch patriot who chose to celebrate his birthday on the 4th of July, marking the event with a parade through the MGM studio lot. MGM films often depicted a world of native-born wealth and sophistication.
Joseph?
Yes, madam?
You can announce dinner in a few moments.
Yes, madam.
To my parents, the movies were an essential part of becoming more like Americans were supposed to be. We never were exactly sure what that meant, but that they were important for the language. They were important for customs, for the way you dressed, the way you moved, when you said thank you, when you sat down, when you stood up, what kind of relationships between classes were indicated, even though we knew they were all fake and that they really had nothing to do with our real lives.
The anti-Sinclair campaign, estimated to have cost between $2 and $10 million, escalated.
Everywhere you looked, there was anti-Sinclair material, but we always dismissed it because when it came to actually counting people, the pro-Sinclair epic forces could outnumber any anti-Sinclair forces. So we thought that anything that we read that was anti was just somebody with money.
For weeks, newspapers played up Sinclair's remark about the unemployed coming to California.
Ladies and gentlemen, your inquiring cameraman decided to look into this much-discussed situation of the unemployed of the United States flocking to California.
We went to this movie and sitting there in the regular seats in the audience, and they ran the newsreel. And then, lo and behold, came this segment showing bums getting off of the freight trains in the freight yards in California, and someone asking what they were doing.
Your inquiring cameraman interviewed 30 stated that they were on their way to California to spend the winter and to remain there permanently if the epic plan went into effect.
And saying that they were coming there because of Upton Sinclair's campaign, well, that enraged me. So I got up in the middle of the performance. It was dark, of course, and I yelled, "I like my movies without propaganda." I would do it again, though, because it was propaganda and it had no place in a newsreel.
As the campaign against Sinclair intensified, Epic supporters believed that a word from FDR could still secure victory. Sinclair wired Roosevelt, reminding him of his promise to mention the Epic plan in his next fireside chat.
We were all glued to our radio sets to hear this and ready to pounce on whatever phrases we could find that would say something favorable about a concept of production for use.
And therefore, the private charity ought, as a matter of good citizenship...
We listened and listened and listened.
current level.
And we never found the phrase, we never found the endorsement, and the people supporting the EPIC campaign, like myself, were very disappointed.
10 days before the election, a Literary Digest poll reported Sinclair trailing Merriam. 5 days later, California Democrat J.F.T. O'Connor visited Sinclair on the president's behalf. He tried to persuade Sinclair to resign in favor of Raymond Haight, a third-party candidate, in the hope that their combined votes would defeat Merriam. Sinclair refused. The next day, O'Connor met with Merriam. They made a deal. California Democrats would support the Republican candidate. In return, Merriam would claim a bipartisan victory and announce his support for the New Deal.
If they say that we are crazy, so was Jefferson. If they say that we are dreamers...
Sinclair's grassroots organization remained strong. The circulation of the weekly Epic News climbed to 2 million. National magazines ran favorable stories on the Epic movement. Sinclair, in a fighting mood, appeared on the cover of Time. He made daily radio broadcasts. On November 2nd, Sinclair told listeners, "The issue of the campaign is, can they fool you with their lies and get you to vote in their interest instead of your own? It's up to you."
Upton Sinclair himself was a pillar of strength during the campaign. In every public appearance, he seemed to be unflappable. He had good humor. He had answers that were to the point. He was on top of the situation.
The thing that stayed with me was almost visionary. This little man seemed like a sort of an avenging angel. You felt like somebody was speaking to your circumstance. And not very few people were in those days.
For me, there was never a low point in the campaign. I was on a high the whole time, and everybody who I knew was on a high. And we were convinced we were going to win.
Name, please.
Still Franklin B. All right.
While the president voted in Hyde Park, New York, voters went to the polls in all 48 states. Midterm elections for Congress, for the Senate, for governor were considered critical for Roosevelt and for the future of the New Deal.
We were very nervous that we might lose our majority, though it seems ridiculous to think so now, but we were unaware, really, of the extent to which the New Deal had seized the imagination and hopes of the people.
How are they voting?
Well, we've had more than 1/3 already of our entire registration.
Is that so? Well, that means that people are taking our advice.
In Los Angeles, MGM and other studios backing Merriam shut down for 2 hours, urging workers to go out and vote.
I voted for Frank Merriam for governor. I generally voted the Republican ticket in those days. I thought that Merriam would be a good governor, but I didn't know anything about him except what I'd read in the Times.
Frank Merriam carried the election with 1.1 million votes to Upton Sinclair's 900,000. The combination of Republicans and old-line Democrats, of Hollywood studios and ad agencies, had proven impossible to beat.
There was a determination that Upton Sinclair was not going to be allowed to win, and he didn't. But the fortunate part of it was that a lot of forward-looking people were elected at that time.
Augustus Hawkins was the first African-American Democrat elected to the state legislature in California.
Out of the some 80 members of the state legislature, we had these 27 epic legislators, mostly people who had never been in politics before. So there was an infusion of new people into the political scene and, of course, and into the Democratic Party.
When the votes were counted nationwide, Democrats won more than 70% of the House, Senate, and governor's races, an unprecedented victory. Roosevelt now had the popular mandate to move ahead with New Deal reforms. High on the list was Social Security.
I was personally hoping that we would achieve a nation in which there was no insecurity, where people would have a dependable source of support in times of unemployment.
The road to Social Security was not easy. Powerful lobbies and resistance, even in his own party, forced Roosevelt to back down on some programs, including national health insurance. The Social Security system President Roosevelt signed into law would permanently change the lives of Americans and their expectations of government.
This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 million of our citizens who will reap direct benefits through unemployment compensation, through old age pensions, and through increased services for the protection of children and the prevention of ill health.
Upton Sinclair's ideas for confronting the economic crisis of the 1930s had reached far beyond California. Pushing from the left, he made room for change at America's center. And he persuaded ordinary Americans that win or lose, they had a voice in the democratic process. In the end, many saw that as the real victory.
It would have been no less than a biblical miracle had he been elected. And people have said to me, "You're wasting your vote. You're foolish." And I've always said, I'd rather vote for what I want and not get it than vote for what I don't want and get lots of it. So I never lost my vote when I voted for Upton Sinclair. I won.